Your grandchild is sitting 3 feet away from you, phone in hand, eyes somewhere else entirely, and you're wondering, does any of this even matter to them? Does you even matter to them? The answer might surprise you. Generation Z grew up online, surrounded by noise, filtered faces, and people performing connection rather than living it. What they're quietly desperate for, more than any generation before them, is someone completely, unapologetically real. That someone could be you. Secret 1. You don't have to understand their world. You have to be curious about it. Most grandparents try to understand Gen Z, and that's exactly where it goes wrong. Understanding feels like a test. Curiosity feels like love. There's a profound difference between saying, "I looked up that band you like," and saying, "Tell me what that music does for you." One is performance, the other is presence. Gen Z has the most finely tuned authenticity radar of any generation alive. They've grown up watching influencers fake everything. So when someone genuinely wants to know, not just nod along, they feel it instantly, and they don't forget it. Secret 2. Share your failures, not just your wisdom. There's a version of grandparent wisdom that sounds like a lecture, and Gen Z will smile politely and vanish into their phone within 90 seconds. But here's what actually lands. The time you failed completely, the business that collapsed, the relationship that broke you, the moment you were absolutely lost and had no idea what came next. These stories don't make you look weak to a 20-year-old who's quietly terrified about their own future. They make you look human. They make you the one person in their life who isn't pretending everything was fine. Secret 3. Respect their opinions, even when they're wrong. Gen Z has opinions, strong ones, about climate, about money, about gender, about systems they inherited and didn't ask for. And many of those opinions will evolve dramatically over the next decade. They know this too, somewhere. But the fastest way to lose their respect is to correct them like a teacher. The grandparents who earn deep loyalty are the ones who say, "That's interesting. Tell me more," and actually mean it. Respect isn't agreement. It's treating someone's mind as worth engaging with. They will remember every adult who did that, and everyone who didn't. Secret 4. Put the phone down first. Here's something nobody says out loud. Gen Z is exhausted by screens. Yes, they use them constantly, but they're also hyper-aware of when a screen takes priority over a person. When a grandparent puts their phone face down without being asked, something registers. When you finish what's in your hand before answering their question, something registers. Physical presence, full, undivided, unrushed, is so rare in their daily world that it feels almost radical when they encounter it. You don't have to be interesting every second. You just have to be there, fully there. That alone sets you apart from the nearly every adult in their life.
Secret 5. Don't try to fix their pain. Witness it. When a young person shares something hard, anxiety, confusion, a friendship that fell apart, the reflex is to help, to solve, to offer the perspective that time heals everything. Resist that reflex entirely. Gen Z doesn't need solutions from their grandparents. They have Google for that. What they need, what they're genuinely starving for, is someone who can sit with them in discomfort without rushing toward the exit. That sounds really hard, said slowly, with eye contact, does more than any advice you could offer. Witnessing someone's pain without flinching is one of the deepest forms of love there is.
Secret 6.
have a life they can admire. This one surprises people. Gen Z doesn't want a grandparent who has made themselves small and quiet and waiting. They want someone who is still doing something. It doesn't have to be dramatic. A garden you're obsessed with, a craft you're mastering, a language you're learning at 73, a morning walk you've never missed in 8 years. Passion at any age is magnetic. Purpose is magnetic. When a grandchild sees that you are actively living, not just existing, it shifts something in how they see aging, how they see time, and quietly, how they see you.
Secret 7. Tell them the truth about money. Not lectures, not warnings, the actual unfiltered truth about what money did and didn't do in your life. Gen Z is entering an economy that feels genuinely broken to them. Housing costs, debt, uncertainty everywhere. And most adults either panic alongside them or dismiss their concerns entirely. A grandparent who says, "Here's what I got wrong with money at your age, and here's what I wish someone had told me," becomes invaluable. Not because you have all the answers, because you have lived answers, real ones, the kind that only come from decades of actual decisions and their real consequences.
Secret 8. Let them see you grow. The most unexpected thing a grandparent can do is change. To say, "I used to think that, I don't anymore." To read a book they recommended and come back having actually reconsidered something. To admit that 70 years of life didn't answer every question. Gen Z was raised to worship authenticity and distrust authority. A grandparent who models intellectual humility, who shows that growth doesn't stop at any age, doesn't just earn respect, they become someone genuinely worth knowing, not as a relic, not as a tradition, as a living, evolving, still curious human being. That is rare at any age.
What runs beneath all 8 of these secrets is one simple truth. Gen Z doesn't respect performance. They've grown up in an era of perfect aesthetics and hollow content, and they have developed an almost preternatural ability to sense when something is real. The grandparents who earn their deep, lasting admiration aren't the ones who try hardest. They're the ones who try honestly, who show up imperfectly, who admit confusion, who keep moving forward anyway. In a world optimized for appearances, a person who simply refuses to perform is revolutionary. That person can be you, and you may not even fully realize the impact you're having.
Imagine your grandchild at 45, sitting somewhere, a kitchen, a car, an ordinary Tuesday, and suddenly thinking of you. Not a holiday version of you, the real one. The one who told them about the year everything went wrong and you kept going anyway. The one who put the phone down. The one who said, "Tell me more," and meant it. The one who is still learning something new at an age when most people have stopped. That memory will shape how they love their own children, how they face their own hard years. You may never know the full size of what you're building right now. None of this requires a grand gesture. Start with one conversation where you ask instead of advise. Share one story you've never told, the one where you didn't have it together. Put your phone away for one afternoon and let the silence be enough. Tell them one true thing about money, about failure, about what you actually believe now versus what you used to. Pick one thing you're genuinely passionate about and let them see it. Small, real, consistent actions over time build something no performance ever could. Presence builds trust. Truth builds connection. Curiosity builds love. You already have everything you need. None of this is guaranteed. Some grandchildren are dealing with things so heavy that connection takes years, not afternoons. Some relationships have old wounds that don't heal easily. And Gen Z, for all their emotional intelligence, are still young people navigating an overwhelming world. So if it doesn't click immediately, that's not failure. It's just life being complicated, as it always has been. What matters is that you keep showing up, authentically, patiently, without conditions attached. Real relationships aren't built in one conversation. They're built in the accumulation of small moments where someone chose presence over performance, again and again and again.
Before this video ends, a question worth sitting with. Which of these 8 secrets feels most difficult for you personally? Not the one you think you should work on. The one that actually makes you slightly uncomfortable. Because that discomfort is information. It's pointing directly at the place where the most growth is available to you right now. Maybe it's vulnerability. Maybe it's truly listening without redirecting. Maybe it's letting someone young enough to be your grandchild teach you something. Whatever it is, that slight resistance you feel, that is exactly where the most meaningful connection is waiting to happen.
8 secrets. Be curious, not just understanding. Share your failures alongside your wisdom. Respect their opinions, even when you disagree. Put your phone down first. Witness their pain instead of fixing it. Have a life they can admire. Tell them the truth about money and let them see you grow. None of these are tricks. None of them are performances. They are all, at their core, the same thing said 8 different ways. Be real, be present, be willing to be human in front of them. That's it. That is the entire strategy, and it turns out, it always has been. If something in this video landed for you, we genuinely love to know which secret felt most true. Drop it in the comments. And if you know a grandparent who's trying, who's quietly putting in the effort, even when it's hard, share this with them, not as a hint, as a gift, because the fact that they're trying matters more than they probably know. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this one about the psychology of how we connect, how we heal, how we show up for the people who matter most. More is coming, and it gets deeper from here.
Respect isn't demanded. It isn't performed. It grows quietly, in small, honest moments, between people who chose to be real with each other. You already know how to do this. You always have. Thank you for watching.
Your parents never told you how much debt they carried, or what really happened to grandma's estate, or that dad's diagnosis came back 2 years before he said a word. Silence wasn't protection. It was a wall, and most families build it without ever meaning to. Money, health, inheritance, 3 topics, 1 shared instinct. Protect the kids by saying nothing. But Gen Z grew up watching everything unfold online, in real time, unfiltered. They don't fear hard truths. They fear being kept in the dark. Here's what actually needs to change.
Sign 1. Assuming silence equals safety. Most parents believe that not talking about money or illness keeps their children calm. It does the opposite. When information is missing, the brain fills the gap with worst-case scenarios. A teenager who senses tension at the dinner table
but hears nothing concrete, doesn't relax. They imagine bankruptcy, divorce, death. The unknown is always louder than the truth, no matter how difficult that truth is. Gen Z, raised on constant access to information, finds silence especially unbearable. They've learned to read between lines, scroll through implications, sense what's being hidden. Protecting them with quiet often produces the exact anxiety parents were trying to avoid. Sign 2. Lecturing instead of listening. There's a pattern that repeats in almost every awkward family money talk. A parent speaks, the child nods, and nothing actually lands. That's because it was never a conversation. It was a lecture wearing the costume of concern. Gen Z responds to dialogue, not directives. They want to ask questions, push back, even disagree without being shut down for it. When a parent opens with, "Let me explain how this works," instead of, "What do you already understand and what worries you?" the door closes before it opens. Real communication starts with curiosity about the other person's mind, not a script you've rehearsed for years. Sign 3. Using guilt or fear as tools. "If something happens to me, you'll have no idea what to do." Sounds like honesty. It actually sounds like a threat. Fear-based framing might get a child's attention for a moment, but it rarely produces trust. It produces avoidance. Gen Z disengages fast from conversations that feel manipulative, even when the manipulation is unintentional. Guilt works the same way. Saying, "After everything we sacrificed," before discussing inheritance, plants resentment, not gratitude. The goal isn't to make someone feel obligated to listen. It's to make them feel safe enough to actually hear what's being said without bracing for an emotional gut punch. Sign 4. Treating money as a forbidden topic. In so many households, money is discussed in whispers, behind closed doors, in tones reserved for diagnoses. That secrecy teaches children that finances are shameful rather than practical. Gen Z is entering adulthood, facing student debt, gig work, and housing costs their parents never experienced, and they need real numbers, not vague warnings. Saying "we're fine" or "don't worry about it" doesn't build security. It builds confusion later when a parent's actual financial situation surfaces unexpectedly. Treating money like any other subject, practical, sometimes uncomfortable, but completely normal to discuss, removes decades of inherited shame around an entirely human topic. Sign 5. Softening health news into euphemism. It's nothing serious, when it is. Just some tests, when there's already a diagnosis. Parents often believe vague language spares their children pain. It usually delays trust instead. When the truth eventually surfaces, and it almost always does, what a young adult remembers isn't the diagnosis, it's the moment they realize they'd been managed instead of informed. Gen Z, more comfortable discussing therapy, anxiety, and mental health openly than any generation before them, generally handles direct medical conversations better than parents expect. They don't need every detail immediately. They need honesty delivered with care. Short, clear, age-appropriate truth instead of a comforting fiction that collapses later. Sign 6. Waiting for the right moment. There is no perfect dinner, no ideal Sunday afternoon, no calm enough week to bring up a will or a cancer scare. Parents wait for conditions that never arrive, and the waiting itself becomes the problem. Years pass, health changes, documents go unsigned. Meanwhile, the child senses something is being postponed but doesn't know what. Gen Z, having grown up watching families fracture under sudden, unplanned crises on social media and their own circles, tends to value preparation over comfort. A short, imperfect conversation today prevents a chaotic, emotional scramble later. Waiting for ease isn't patience. It's avoidance wearing a calmer face.
Sign 7. Making it a one-way information dump. Sitting a child down and delivering every financial detail in one long monologue feels efficient. It rarely works. Information overload without dialogue creates passive listening, not understanding. Gen Z processes complex topics best through back and forth, asking, clarifying, even challenging assumptions, rather than receiving a finished report. A single 20-minute download about retirement accounts, insurance, and end-of-life wishes is forgotten within days because there was no space to actually engage with it. Breaking these talks into smaller, ongoing exchanges, spread across weeks or months, lets information settle and lets the child participate rather than simply absorb whatever they're handed all at once. Sign 8. Comparing their reality to how we did it. We managed without any of this help. Shuts a conversation down faster than almost anything else. Comparing economic conditions across generations ignores how dramatically circumstances have shifted. Wages, housing costs, healthcare expenses simply don't map onto the past the way parents assume. When a young adult brings up financial stress and is met with comparison instead of acknowledgement, they stop bringing it up at all. Gen Z isn't asking for sympathy for having it harder. They're asking to be heard without their experience being measured against a different economy entirely. Validation, not comparison, keeps these conversations open instead of quietly ending them. Sign 9. Avoiding inheritance as too morbid. Bringing up a will feels to many parents like inviting death into the room, so it gets postponed indefinitely until a crisis forces the conversation under the worst possible circumstances. Discussing inheritance early isn't morbid, it's responsible. It prevents confusion, conflict, and resentment between siblings later, and it gives children clarity about decisions that will eventually affect them directly. Gen Z, generally more comfortable discussing mortality openly than previous generations were taught to be, often welcomes this honesty more than parents expect. Framing the conversation around values, what matters, what's being protected, why decisions were made, turns a feared topic into one rooted in care rather than dread. Sign 10. Dismissing their financial reality. When a 26-year-old explains they can't save the way their parents did at that age, the worst response is disbelief. Skyrocketing rent, stagnant wages, unstable gig work, and crushing student loans aren't excuses. They're documented economic shifts. Parents who dismiss this reality as laziness or poor planning alienate the very child they're trying to guide. Listening first, without correcting or minimizing, builds the trust required for any financial conversation to matter. Gen Z isn't rejecting financial responsibility. They're navigating a fundamentally different landscape than the one their parents learned in, and acknowledging that difference openly is what makes practical advice land instead of bounce off entirely. Sign 11. Making it transactional instead of value-based. Framing inheritance, support, or financial help purely around numbers misses what actually matters to most young adults, the why behind the decision. Here's what you're getting lands very differently than here's what we hope this allows you to build. Gen Z tends to respond strongly to purpose and meaning, even in financial conversations. Connecting decisions to values, security, opportunity, family continuity transforms a cold transaction into something that feels intentional and caring. Without that context, money can feel like an obligation being handed down. With it, the same money feels like trust being extended,
which changes how it's received and how it's used. Sign 12. Treating it as a one-time conversation. The final mistake is believing one serious talk solves everything. A single sit-down about money, health, or inheritance can't cover every detail, every change, every new circumstance that arises over years. These topics evolve, diagnoses change, finances shift, family situations develop. Treating the conversation as ongoing rather than a box to check keeps the relationship adaptable. Gen Z values consistency over grand gestures. Regular, smaller check-ins build far more trust than one heavy, emotionally loaded discussion that's never revisited. Keeping the door open permanently, rather than closing it after one difficult talk, is what actually protects the relationship long after the first conversation ends. Underneath every one of these patterns is the same root fear, that honesty will cause pain, so silence must be safer. But pain delayed doesn't disappear, it compounds. Families that avoid these conversations don't end up with less conflict. They end up with more, just later, sharper, and tangled with resentment about what wasn't said in time. Gen Z, raised in an era of radical transparency online, often feels these gaps more acutely than parents realize. What looks like protection from the outside can feel from the inside like exclusion, being kept apart from decisions and realities that directly shape their own future. Start small. Pick one topic, not all three, and bring it up casually, outside of a crisis. Ask questions before giving answers. Use plain language instead of euphemism. Revisit the conversation regularly instead of treating it as finished. None of this requires perfect timing or a flawless script. It requires consistency and honesty over polish. And here's the hopeful part. These conversations almost always go better than parents fear. Most Gen Z adults aren't looking to avoid hard truths. They're looking to be trusted with them. The discomfort of starting is temporary. The trust built afterward tends to last for decades. So ask yourself honestly, which of these 12 patterns sounds familiar in your own family? Maybe it's the silence around money. Maybe it's softened health updates, or an inheritance conversation that's been postponed for years without ever being named out loud. We covered assuming silence protects, lecturing instead of listening, fear and guilt tactics, treating money as taboo, softening health news, waiting for the perfect moment, one-way dumps, generational comparison, avoiding inheritance talk, dismissing financial reality, transactional framing, in treating it all as a single conversation rather than an ongoing one. Recognizing the pattern is always the first step toward changing it. If even one of these signs hit close to home, you're not alone, and you're definitely not failing as a parent or as a child navigating this. These conversations are hard for almost every family, in almost every generation, for the same underlying reasons. Drop a comment below. Which sign do you most need to start with? Money, health, or inheritance? I read through these regularly, and your experience genuinely shapes future videos like this one. And if this helped you see your own family a little more clearly, subscribe. There's a lot more honest psychology coming, built exactly for conversations like this. These conversations were never meant to be easy. They were meant to be honest. Every generation inherits silence from the one before it, and every generation has the chance to break that pattern, one small, imperfect conversation at a time. You don't need the perfect words. You need the willingness to start. Whether it's a quick comment about the will, an honest update about a diagnosis, or simply saying, "Let's actually talk about money sometime," that's enough to begin. The families who navigate this well aren't the ones with no fear. They're the ones who talk anyway. Thanks for watching.
They call you lazy, entitled, soft. They say you can't handle a phone call, can't handle a boss, can't handle real life. But what if everything they think they know about you is wrong? Built on a lie repeated so many times, everyone just stopped questioning it.
By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which myths are lies and why people believe them anyway. Stay until the end, because myth number 7 is the one that even Gen Z themselves don't fully understand about their own generation.
Every generation gets misunderstood by the one before it. Boomers were called rebellious. Millennials were called entitled. Now it's Gen Z's turn. But this isn't just generational grumbling. These myths shape hiring decisions, family relationships, even how young people see themselves.
Sign 1. They're lazy and don't want to work. Older generations look at Gen Z and see kids who quit jobs after 2 weeks, who ask about work-life balance in the first interview, who refuse unpaid overtime. The conclusion feels obvious. They just don't want to work. But look closer, and the picture flips entirely. This is a generation that watched their parents grind for decades and still lose everything in 2008. They watched loyalty go unrewarded, pensions disappear, houses become unaffordable, no matter how hard anyone worked. So when they ask for boundaries, they're not avoiding work. They're refusing to repeat a mistake they watched destroy the people who raised them.
Sign 2. They're addicted to their phones and can't communicate. The image is everywhere. A group of young people sitting together, all silently scrolling, supposedly incapable of real conversation. It looks like proof of a broken generation. But the phone isn't replacing connection here. It's carrying it. Gen Z built friendships across continents through group chats, organized real-world protests through hashtags, found communities for rare illnesses and niche identities that didn't exist in any physical room nearby. They communicate constantly, just through different channels than the ones their parents grew up trusting. Calling it isolation misses what's actually happening. It's connection, just translated into a language older generations never learned to read. Sign 3. They're too sensitive and can't handle criticism. A manager raises their voice, and suddenly the headline is that Gen Z can't take feedback. But ask what actually happened, and often it wasn't feedback at all. It was humiliation dressed up as toughness. This generation grew up watching workplace bullying get exposed online, watched mental health stop being a taboo subject and start being something you're allowed to name out loud. Wanting respect instead of being torn down isn't fragility. It's a basic boundary that previous generations were simply never given permission to ask for. The standard didn't lower. It finally got named. Sign 4. They expect everything handed to them. The stereotype paints a picture of young people demanding promotions they haven't earned, salaries they haven't worked for. But look at the math they're actually living inside. Tuition costs have tripled since their parents' generation graduated. Entry-level jobs now ask for 5 years of experience. Nobody will give them the chance to gain. Rent eats half a paycheck before groceries even enter the conversation. Asking for fair pay, asking for a livable wage, asking for a system that actually rewards effort. None of that is entitlement. It's arithmetic.
They're not asking for more than previous generations got. They're asking for what was promised and never delivered. Sign 5. They have no work ethic or discipline. People imagine a generation that can't sit still, can't focus, can't push through something hard. But this is the generation building businesses from a bedroom at 17, learning coding and design and marketing entirely on their own time, with no instructor and no syllabus. Self-taught discipline doesn't always look like a 9 to 5 with a punch clock. It looks like late nights, teaching yourself a skill nobody handed you because the traditional path stopped guaranteeing anything. The discipline didn't disappear. It just stopped looking the way previous generations were trained to recognize it. Sign 6. They're obsessed with their image and identity. The criticism sounds simple. Too many labels, too much focus on identity, too much time spent figuring out who they are instead of just living. But identity exploration isn't vanity. It's survival skill for a world that changes faster than any generation before has had to navigate. Careers shift every few years now. Communities form and dissolve online overnight. In that kind of instability, knowing exactly who you are isn't indulgence. It's the one stable anchor available. Previous generations had institutions to define them, a job for life, a hometown, a fixed role. Gen Z had to build that anchor themselves from the inside out. Sign 7. They don't want to grow up or take on responsibility. This is the one most people get backwards. Delaying marriage, delaying home ownership, living with parents longer. It looks like a refusal to grow up. But ask why, and the answer isn't immaturity, it's economics. The traditional markers of adulthood were built on a foundation of affordable housing and stable careers that simply doesn't exist anymore for most of them. Choosing not to take on debt they can't repay, choosing not to rush into commitments the economy won't support. That's not avoidance. That's responsibility, just redefined for a world where the old rules quietly stopped working, even though everyone kept pretending they still applied. Sign 8. They can't handle real-world pressure. People assume a generation raised with mental health language and therapy speak must be fragile underneath it all. But naming anxiety isn't the same as being overwhelmed by it. This is a generation that came of age through a pandemic, climate anxiety, school lockdown drills, and economic collapse, all before most of them turned 25. They didn't avoid pressure. They lived inside more of it than almost any generation in recent memory, and they built a vocabulary to survive it instead of suffering in silence the way their grandparents were taught to. That's not weakness. That's a different, more honest way of carrying weight. Sign 9. They're not loyal to anything. Jobs, brands, relationships. The accusation is that nothing means anything to them. They switch jobs, switch brands, switch partners without a second thought. But loyalty has to be earned to be given. And this generation watched companies lay off thousands the same quarter they posted record profits. They watched institutions break promises again and again. So they stopped offering blind trust and started offering conditional trust instead. Loyalty in exchange for being treated like a person, not a number. That isn't disloyalty. That's a generation that learned the hard way exactly what happens when you give your trust to something that was never going to protect it back.
Sign 10. They're more selfish than previous generations. This might be the cruelest myth of all, because the evidence points the opposite direction entirely. This is a generation more likely to support causes outside their own self-interest, more likely to choose ethical brands even at a higher cost, more likely to organize collective action for climate,
for justice, for people they've never even met. Selfishness doesn't build mutual aid networks. Selfishness doesn't show up to protests for strangers' rights. What looks like self-focus from the outside is often just self-awareness, naming their own limits clearly enough that they actually have something left over to give to everyone else.
Step back, and a pattern emerges across every single myth. Each one judges Gen Z by the standards of a world that no longer exists. A world with affordable housing, stable jobs, slower technology, quieter news cycles. The generations before them aren't wrong to notice the differences. They're wrong to assume the differences mean decline. What looks like a flaw up close is often just an adaptation, viewed without the context of what it's adapting to. Every generation gets misjudged by people, measuring them against a map of a world that has already disappeared.
And here's what gets lost in all the headlines and hot takes. Being constantly misunderstood by the people who are supposed to mentor you takes a real toll. Imagine being told daily that you're lazy while you're working 2 jobs to afford rent. Imagine being called fragile while quietly managing anxiety nobody acknowledged in previous generations. That gap between who you actually are and who you're assumed to be, it isolates you. It makes you doubt your own instincts, and it makes the relationship between generations feel less like mentorship and more like an ongoing trial you never agreed to stand in.
So what actually closes that gap? First, ask before you assume. If a behavior looks strange, ask the reason behind it instead of inventing one. Second, separate the generation from the moment. Most generational flaws are really just responses to economic and technological conditions nobody chose. Third, if you're Gen Z yourself, stop internalizing labels that were never built around your actual life. You don't owe anyone an old-world definition of success. And if you're from an older generation, remember, every single myth said about Gen Z today was said almost word for word about you decades ago. None of this means Gen Z is perfect, and no generation ever is. There are real challenges, short attention spans shaped by algorithms, real struggles with in-person interaction, genuine difficulty with delayed gratification in some contexts. Nuance matters more than blanket praise or blanket criticism. But the difference between judgment and understanding is simple. Judgment assumes the worst explanation. Understanding asks for the real one. And once you start asking, you usually find a generation doing its absolute best with conditions no generation before it has had to face at the same time, all at once. So ask yourself honestly, which of these myths have you believed, maybe without even realizing it? Have you judged a young coworker for setting a boundary you never had permission to set yourself? Have you assumed disengagement where there was actually self-protection? And if you're Gen Z watching this, which of these labels have you quietly accepted as true about yourself, even though it was never accurate to begin with? Awareness is the first step out of a stereotype, whether you're the one carrying it or the one placing it on someone else. Let's bring it together. Not lazy, protecting themselves from repeating their parents' mistakes. Not disconnected, communicating through different channels entirely. Not fragile, finally naming what previous generations were never allowed to. Not entitled, doing basic math on an economy that stopped adding up. Not undisciplined, self-taught in ways no instructor ever measured. Not vain, anchoring identity in an unstable world. Not immature, redefining responsibility around real conditions. Not weak, carrying more pressure with more honesty. Not disloyal, conditional because blind trust kept getting betrayed. And not selfish, quietly consistently showing up for people they'll never even meet. If even one of these myths hit close to home, for you, your kids, your coworkers, or yourself, drop a comment and tell us which one surprised you the most. This channel exists to break down exactly this kind of misunderstanding, the gap between who people actually are and who they get assumed to be. If that matters to you, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this conversation still to have. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, a parent, a manager, a friend who's still stuck on the old narrative, this is the video to send them. Every generation eventually becomes the one being misunderstood by the next, and every generation eventually looks back and realizes how much of what was said about them simply wasn't true. Gen Z isn't broken, and they're not the disaster the headlines suggest. They're a generation adapting, in real time, to conditions nobody handed them a manual for. Maybe the real lesson isn't about Gen Z at all. It's about how quickly we reach for judgment instead of curiosity. Thanks for watching this far. If this changed how you see things, even slightly, that's exactly the point. You said something totally normal, and they just looked at you. That specific look, not rude, not angry, just distant. Like you'd spoken in a language they used to know, but quietly stopped using. Gen Z didn't just grow up with smartphones. They grew up inside a world that was already broken. Financial crises, climate fear, a pandemic. That shapes a mind differently. This isn't attitude. This is adaptation. Here's the first pattern. Gen Z has an almost allergic reaction to anything that feels performed. You know, that polished, rehearsed version of yourself you pull out at dinner parties? They clock it instantly, and they quietly disconnect. This generation grew up watching influencers fall from grace the moment their masks slipped. They learned early, authenticity outlasts image. So they lead with their real self, flaws, contradictions, all of it, before anyone can be disappointed later. For them, being genuine isn't vulnerability, it's strategy. If you want to connect with them, drop the performance. They're not judging the real you. They're waiting for it. Sign 2. Mental health is not a weakness, it's a language. If a Gen Z person tells you they're triggered or they need to protect their energy, they're not being dramatic. They're using the language of psychology the way older generations used the language of toughness. For them, naming an emotion isn't weakness, it's precision. They grew up with therapy on TikTok, breathing exercises in school, and honest conversations about anxiety in group chats. Mental health became their shared vocabulary. So when they say, "I can't handle this right now," that's not avoidance, that's self-awareness. The older instinct to say, "push through it," lands like an insult. Listen first. The words are different. The pain is the same. Sign 3. They don't trust institutions. They trust people. Banks, governments, corporations, traditional media. Gen Z grew up watching these structures fail, or lie, or both. So they didn't transfer their trust to the next institution in line. They transferred it sideways, to people, specific people, a creator who shows their actual apartment, a founder who admits when the product broke, a teacher who says, "I don't know, let's find out together." That's who they follow. That's who they buy from. That's who they vote for. If you're trying to reach them through authority alone, title, status, credentials, it won't land. but show them who you actually are, they'll listen to everything you say. Sign 4. Boundaries are sacred, not selfish. Older generations were often taught that saying no was rude, that enduring discomfort was character building, that you showed up regardless of how you felt, because that's what responsible people do. Gen Z received a completely different message. They were taught by psychology, by burnout stories, by watching parents collapse under overwork, that a boundary is not a wall, it's a door with a lock you control. When they say, "That doesn't work for me," they mean it neutrally, not aggressively. They're not rejecting you, they're protecting something. Respect the boundary, and the relationship deepens. Push against it, and the door closes. Quietly, permanently. Sign 5. They process out loud, online. Something confusing happens when an older person watches a Gen Z individual post about their bad day, their therapy session, their existential crisis, publicly for thousands of followers. The reaction is often, "Why would you share that?" But for Gen Z, public processing is community. They're not seeking pity. They're saying, "I'm going through this. Who else is?" And the answer is always, thousands of people. This is how they build connection. This is how they heal. This is how they feel less alone in a world that can feel very isolating, very fast. It's not oversharing. It's a different architecture of belonging. Sign 6. Work is not an identity. It's an exchange. For decades, career was character. You were your job. You stayed loyal, worked the extra hours, didn't complain, because that's how you proved your worth. Gen Z watched that contract break in real time. They watched parents get laid off after 20 years of loyalty. They watched companies pivot, restructure, disappear. So they made a different agreement with work. I will give you my skills, my time, my energy, and you will give me fair pay, purpose, and a life outside these hours. That's not laziness, that's clarity. They're not less committed, they're committed to different things, and they're honest about which things those are. Sign 7. Hyper-awareness of social dynamics. Gen Z reads a room differently than any generation before them. They've been socialized in comment sections, group chats, and cancel culture, environments where one misread social cue can spiral fast. So they developed something almost like social sonar. They notice who gets interrupted in a meeting. They notice whose idea gets credited. They notice the energy shift when someone walks in. They notice what's not being said. This can look like overthinking. It's actually hypervigilance, a finely tuned social intelligence developed under constant public scrutiny. If you're dismissing their observations as paranoia, stop. They're usually right, and they're always paying attention. Sign 8. Identity is fluid, not fixed. Here's one that genuinely confuses older generations. Gen Z doesn't see identity as something you declare once and defend forever. They see it as something you explore, revise, and grow into, sometimes publicly. Their values might shift, their labels might change, their understanding of themselves deepens over time, and they're not embarrassed by that. They call it growth. Older frameworks called it inconsistency. The difference is philosophical. One generation was taught, know who you are and stand firm. The other was taught, you are allowed to become. Neither is wrong, but if you approach them expecting a fixed final answer about who they are, you'll miss who they're becoming. Sign 9. They expect systemic thinking, not just personal responsibility. When something goes wrong, a job lost, a relationship failed, a goal unreached, older generations often defaulted to one question: what did I do wrong?
Personal responsibility was the primary lens. Gen Z asks a second question alongside it. What system created this situation? They've grown up analyzing structures, economic inequality, algorithmic bias, institutional racism, climate policy. They see individual choices inside larger contexts. This isn't excuse-making, it's systems thinking, and it's actually how psychologists and sociologists have long understood human behavior. When you tell them to just work harder, they hear you ignoring the board while pointing at one chess piece. Acknowledge the system. They'll respect you for it.
Sign 10. Hope is a choice they make consciously. This last one might surprise you. Despite everything, the anxiety, the climate grief, the distrust, the burnout, Gen Z chooses hope. Deliberately, intentionally, not naively. They've looked at the world clearly, maybe more clearly than any generation before them, and they've decided that giving up is not a neutral act. It's a choice with consequences. So they build communities, they create, they advocate, they plant things, literally and metaphorically. They hold on to futures that haven't arrived yet. This isn't optimism from ignorance, it's resilience from knowledge. And honestly, watching them choose hope anyway, that's not something to pity. That's something to learn from.
Every generation is a response to the world it inherited. Gen Z inherited a world mid-collapse and mid-transformation simultaneously. They were handed screens before they could read, uncertainty before they could vote, and a future that kept changing its shape. Their mental patterns aren't random, they're rational adaptations. The authenticity comes from seeing performance fail. The boundaries come from watching people burn out. The systemic thinking comes from watching individual effort not be enough. When you understand the origin, the pattern stops being frustrating and starts being legible. These aren't flaws, they're features built for exactly the environment they were given.
Here's what actually happens when the gap stays open. A parent and a child stop talking about anything real. A manager loses their best young employee to a company that actually listened. A teacher watches a student disengage, not from laziness, but from feeling fundamentally unseen. A friendship quietly fades because neither person knew how to cross the distance. The generational gap isn't just cultural inconvenience. It has real costs. Relationships that could have been deep stay shallow. Potential that could have flourished leaves. And the quiet grief of that, on both sides, goes largely unnamed. Understanding doesn't fix everything, but it's where everything fixable begins. So what do you actually do with all of this? First, get curious instead of defensive. When something they say confuses you, ask. Genuinely ask. Second, drop the comparison. When I was your age, closes doors every time. Third, listen for the feeling under the language. The words might be unfamiliar. The emotion underneath them is ancient. Fourth, share your own uncertainty. Gen Z respects honesty over authority every time. And fifth, give it time. Understanding a different mind isn't a switch, it's a practice. But every conversation where you choose curiosity over judgment, that's a bridge being built, quietly, permanently, and from both sides. One important thing before we go further. Gen Z is not one thing. Not every person under 30 shares every pattern we talked about. There are conservative Gen Z kids, and anxious ones, and ambitious ones, and deeply traditional ones. Generations are tendencies, not templates. The patterns in this video are real and well documented, but they're starting points, not verdicts. The same way you wouldn't want to be reduced to a generational stereotype, neither do they. Use what you learned today as a map, not a cage. Get to know the actual person in front of you. The map just helps you arrive at the conversation, ready to listen. Before we wrap, sit with this for a moment. As you listen to these 10 patterns, what came up? Was there a sign that made you uncomfortable? One that made you recognize yourself, maybe more than you expected? Because here's the quiet truth. Many of these patterns didn't originate with Gen Z. Authenticity, boundaries, mental health awareness, systemic thinking, older generations wanted these things too. They just didn't always have the language or the permission. So maybe what Gen Z is expressing isn't so foreign after all. Maybe it's something you always felt and never quite knew how to say. That's worth thinking about. Let's bring it all together. 1. They lead with authenticity, not performance. 2. Mental health is their language, not their excuse. 3. They trust people, not institutions. 4. Boundaries are how they protect what matters. 5. They process publicly because community is how they heal. 6. Work is an exchange, not an identity. 7. They read social dynamics with precision. 8. Identity is fluid and always becoming. 9. They think in systems, not just in personal choices. 10. They choose hope consciously, knowing exactly what they're choosing it against. 10 patterns. One generation trying to make sense of an overwhelming world. Sound familiar?
Which of these 10 patterns surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if someone in your life came to mind while you were watching, a kid, a colleague, a student, share this with them. Sometimes the best bridge is just saying, I watched something that made me think of you. If you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of how different minds work, subscribe. We go here every week. And if this video gave you even one new way to see someone you care about, that's everything. That's exactly why we do this. See you in the next one.
You snapped at someone you love and immediately thought, where did that come from? You're an adult, you know better. But something old took over, something fast, something that bypassed every rational thought you had. This video is about that something.
None of this means you're broken. It means you're human. The signs we're about to cover aren't character flaws. They're patterns, learned early, triggered often. And once you see them clearly, something shifts. Stay with me.
Here's what's actually happening. When stress hits, the brain doesn't always reach for its adult logic. It reaches for what worked at age 7. Psychologists call it emotional regression. It's not weakness, it's wiring, and most of us do it without realizing.
Sign 1. You shut down instead of speaking up. The meeting gets tense. Your partner says something that stings. A friend crosses a line, and you go completely quiet. Not because you have nothing to say. You have everything to say. But something closes. A door you didn't consciously shut. This is one of the earliest childhood responses a person learns. When speaking felt dangerous. When saying the wrong thing meant punishment, rejection, or being dismissed, silence became protection. The body remembers that. Even decades later,
when the actual danger is gone. The nervous system still sends the same signal. Don't speak. Stay small. Wait it out. Adulthood gave you words, but the child inside still flinches.
Sign 2. You need approval before you can feel okay. You make a decision, a good one. You feel fine about it until someone raises an eyebrow. And suddenly, you're not fine anymore. You replay it, second guess it, look for signs that you were wrong. This is the approval loop, and it starts in childhood, when love felt conditional, when being good enough meant being accepted. The child learns to outsource their sense of self, to read the room before feeling safe in their own skin. The adult version looks like seeking validation constantly, from partners, bosses, strangers online. Not because you're insecure in the shallow sense, because somewhere a younger version of you learned that other people's reactions were information about your worth.
Sign 3. You catastrophize when plans fall apart. The flight gets delayed. The plan changes last minute. Something small breaks, and suddenly it feels enormous. Not just inconvenient, wrong, like something is fundamentally collapsing. Your reaction has outgrown the event. That gap between what happened and how it lands is a childhood signature. Children live in a world where small disruptions genuinely were big. When routines broke, it sometimes meant safety broke. When plans changed, it meant unpredictability, which for a child can feel like threat. The adult brain knows a delayed flight is not a catastrophe, but the emotional brain, the one running old software, fires the alarm anyway, loud, fast, before logic gets a word in.
Sign 4. You people please to avoid conflict. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh at jokes that land wrong. You change your opinion mid-sentence because you felt the other person tense up. And afterward, you feel this strange, hollow tiredness, like you spent the whole day acting. People-pleasing isn't kindness, it's a survival strategy. For a child in an unpredictable environment, making others comfortable was often the only sense of control available. Keep the peace, avoid the reaction, stay safe. The body got very good at it, too good. Now in adult life, even when there's no real threat, the mechanism kicks in automatically. You perform okayness to avoid a conflict that may not even exist.
Sign 5. You take criticism as a verdict on who you are. Someone says your work needs changes. Your partner asks you to do something differently. A friend offers feedback, and it doesn't land as information, it lands as judgment. Not this thing needs fixing, but you are the problem. Children don't have the psychological distance to separate their actions from their identity. When a parent criticized a behavior, it often felt like a statement about worth. The child didn't hear, "That was a bad choice." They heard, "You are bad." That wiring persists. So as an adult, when someone points at your work, your nervous system sometimes hears the older message and defends against it, with shame or anger, or both. Sign 6. You freeze when you need to make decisions. The decision isn't even that big, but you can't move. You go back and forth. You ask everyone's opinion. You make a list, then ignore it, then make another. Hours pass, days sometimes. And somewhere under all of it is a quiet dread, not of making the wrong choice, but of being blamed for it. For a child whose choices were often met with criticism or ridicule, deciding became dangerous. It was safer to not choose, to wait, to defer. That habit became a default. As an adult,
The paralysis returns whenever the emotional stakes feel high, even when the rational stakes are low. The child inside is still afraid to get it wrong.
7. You punish yourself when you fail. You make a mistake, a normal human mistake, and you don't just acknowledge it and move forward. You go in hard. You replay it relentlessly. Call yourself names you would never say to someone else. Withhold rest, pleasure, self-compassion, as if punishment is what correction requires. This pattern almost always traces back to a childhood environment where love or acceptance was withdrawn after failure. The child learned, when I mess up, I lose something. So the adult mind recreates the punishment preemptively, to feel in control, or to avoid the shame of being punished by others. It looks like high standards, but often it's an old wound doing the accounting.
Here's the psychological mechanism underneath all of it. When you were young, your nervous system built a map of what's safe, what's dangerous, who to trust, and how to behave to stay loved. That map was built from experience, from repeated moments that taught your brain what to expect from the world. The problem is, that map doesn't automatically update when you grow up. It gets carried forward, layered over with adult language and adult logic, but still fundamentally drawn by a younger version of you. So when a current situation rhymes with an old one, same emotional frequency, different facts, the old map activates, and you respond to now as if it were then.
The cost of all this isn't just emotional, it's relational, it's professional. It's the relationships where you stayed quiet too long and the resentment built up silently, the opportunities you didn't take because the old fear was louder than the real odds, the exhaustion of managing yourself constantly, monitoring your reactions, apologizing for things that weren't wrongs, bracing for judgments that never came. That's a significant tax on a human life. And the heaviest part is that most of it happens below awareness. You weren't choosing these patterns, you inherited them. They served a real purpose once. Understanding that, fully, without self-blame, is actually where change begins.
The research is clear on one thing. Awareness alone doesn't rewire patterns, but awareness plus pause does. The moment between the trigger and your response, that gap, is where adult choice lives. Right now, for most people, that gap is about half a second wide. The work is widening it, not through willpower, but through practice. When you notice a childhood pattern activating, the shutdown, the freeze, the spiral, the first move isn't to fix it, it's to name it, out loud if possible. That's the old response. Naming it engages the prefrontal cortex. It creates just enough distance for a different choice to become available. Small, consistent, real.
These patterns don't disappear overnight, and that's not failure, that's neuroscience. The brain changes through repetition, not revelation. Every time you catch the old pattern and choose differently, even slightly differently, you're building new circuitry, not replacing the old, layering over it. The goal isn't to become someone without a past, it's to become someone who isn't controlled by it. And here's the quiet truth most people miss. The fact that you recognize yourself in these signs means the adult in you is already watching, already aware. That part of you, the one that wanted to understand, that's not the child. That's you, now.
Take a moment with this, not to judge, just to notice. Which of these 7 patterns shows up most in your life right now? Not theoretically, actually. In your relationships, at work, when you're alone and something goes wrong. Most people find that one or two patterns are dominant, returning across different contexts, different people, different years. That's not a coincidence. That's the thread. And finding your thread isn't about shame or diagnosis. It's about orientation. You can't navigate from where you think you are. You navigate from where you actually are. So sit with the pattern that felt most like you. That's your starting point, not your ceiling. Let's bring it together. 7 signs that you're responding from the child inside, even when you want to show up as an adult. 1. Shutting down instead of speaking. 2. Needing approval to feel okay. 3. Catastrophizing when plans break. 4. People-pleasing to avoid conflict. 5. Taking criticism as a verdict on your worth. 6. Freezing when decisions are needed. 7. Punishing yourself hard when you fail. Every single one of these is a learned response, learned early because it worked, and every single one of them can be gradually, genuinely shifted, not through force, but through understanding, repetition, and the kind of patience you probably never got shown.
If this video landed for you, if you recognized yourself in more than one of these signs, I want to hear which one hit hardest. Drop it in the comments. Not because it's a fun engagement exercise, but because reading those comments genuinely shapes what I cover next. You're not alone in this, and sometimes just seeing your pattern named in writing by your own hand does something. Subscribe if you want to go deeper on this kind of content. Every video on this channel is built around one idea. Understanding yourself isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of every other thing you're trying to build in your life.
The child inside you wasn't wrong to learn what they learned. They were surviving. They were doing exactly what they needed to do with what they had. But you're not there anymore. You have more now. More tools, more awareness, more capacity. The patterns that protected you then don't have to run you now. That's not a demand. It's an invitation, one you can take at whatever pace feels real. Watch the next video, read something, talk to someone you trust, or just sit with what you heard today and let it settle. Change doesn't announce itself. It usually starts exactly like this, quietly, in a moment when you finally saw something clearly. Your mother walks into your apartment without knocking. Again. She glances at your fridge, your mail, your life, like she still owns it. You freeze. Something in your chest tightens, because this isn't the first time. And deep down, you already know it won't be the last. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll finally have words for what you've felt your whole life. 10 quiet betrayals millennials know by heart. Moments parents cross the line and call it love. You'll recognize every one, and maybe, for the first time, feel less alone. Here's the truth nobody says out loud. Loving your child doesn't give you the right to control them forever. Most parents don't mean harm. They grew up believing closeness meant no boundaries at all. But that confusion left a generation exhausted, guilty, and unsure where love ends and control begins.
The first sign is simple, and almost every millennial knows it instantly. Parents who show up unannounced. No text, no call, just a knock on the door, or worse, a key they never gave back. They walk in like the space is still theirs, glancing around, commenting on the mess,
the empty fridge, the unmade bed. To them, it feels like love, like closeness. But to you, it feels like your home stopped being yours the moment you handed them a spare key. Boundaries aren't rejection. Asking someone to call first isn't cruelty. It's basic respect between two adults. Yet saying that out loud still feels like betrayal. The second sign hides behind good intentions, relentless, unsolicited advice. You mention a new job, a partner, a decision about your own life, and before you finish the sentence, they're already telling you what you're doing wrong. Not because they're cruel, because in their mind, wisdom is love, and staying quiet feels like abandoning you. But when advice becomes pressure, when just a suggestion turns into disappointment if you don't comply, it stops being guidance. It becomes control, wearing a caring mask. And every time you swallow your own judgment to keep the peace, you lose a little more of your own voice. The third sign is quieter, but it cuts deeper. Guilt as a weapon. You say no to a last-minute request, or you set a simple boundary, and suddenly the sighing starts. I guess I'll just be alone then, after everything I did for you. The words are soft, but the message is clear. Your independence is an act of betrayal. So you cave again, not because you agree, but because the guilt is heavier than the boundary. Over time, you stop trusting your own no. You start apologizing for needs that were never wrong to have. That's not love asking for closeness. That's fear disguised as affection. The fourth sign shows up at every family dinner. Comparison. Your sister already bought a house. Your cousin's kids are so well behaved. It sounds casual, but it never is. Comparison is a subtle way of saying you're not enough as you are. And the cruelest part is how it works. You start measuring your own life against a scoreboard you never agreed to play on. Your timeline, your choices, your happiness, quietly ranked against someone else's. Even when you succeed, there's a whisper in the back of your mind asking if it's really good enough. That whisper didn't come from nowhere. It was planted quietly, again and again. The fifth sign is the one that makes you feel invisible. They simply don't hear your no. You say you can't make it to Sunday dinner, and somehow you end up going anyway. You say you're not ready to talk about kids, and the questions keep coming, dinner after dinner. Your no gets treated like an opening bid, something to negotiate around rather than respect. And slowly, you learn something painful, that your voice only matters when it agrees with theirs. So you stop saying no as clearly. You soften it, cushion it, apologize before you even finish the sentence. Not because you changed your mind, because saying no clearly never seemed to actually work. There are a few more important signs ahead, but if this resonates with you, subscribe to Mind Patterns so you don't miss our upcoming breakdowns on psychology and mental health. The sixth sign is written on your body before it's ever spoken out loud. You've gained weight. You look tired. Are you eating enough? Said with a smile, wrapped in concern, but landing like a verdict every single time. Your body becomes a subject open for public review, as if it still belongs to the family more than it belongs to you. And here's the quiet damage. You start seeing yourself through their eyes before you even look in the mirror. Every meal, every photo, every reunion carries a small flicker of anxiety. Not about your health, about their opinion.
That's not care. That's ownership, dressed up as concern. The seventh sign appears the moment you become a parent yourself. They treat your children like a second chance to relive their own parenting, their way. They override your rules the second you leave the room. Sugar you said no to, screen time you limited, bedtimes that suddenly don't apply when grandma's in charge. When you gently correct them, you're met with, "I raised 3 kids, I know what I'm doing," as if experience gives them the final say over children that aren't theirs to raise. It's not really about sugar or screens. It's about authority, about who gets the last word in a life you're now responsible for. And every override is a quiet message. Your judgment still doesn't count as much as theirs.
The eighth sign is the one that feels like a quiet violation. They go through your things, your phone left on the counter, your mail, your messages, somehow always just glancing, never truly private. Maybe it started small, back when you were a teenager, and it simply never stopped, because to them, you're still that teenager who needs watching. But you're not 16 anymore. Privacy isn't secrecy. Needing a locked door, an unread message, a life that isn't fully reported back, that's not distance. That's the basic architecture of being your own person. When that boundary keeps getting crossed, it doesn't just feel intrusive. It quietly tells you that trust was never really given, only monitored. The ninth sign hides inside every gift with strings attached, money used as leverage, a loan that comes with a lecture, a wedding contribution that comes with a seating chart veto. After everything we paid for becomes a phrase that resurfaces in every disagreement years later, like an invoice that never really closes. Financial help stops being generosity and quietly turns into a debt of obedience. You find yourself agreeing to things you don't want, not because you were persuaded, but because refusing feels ungrateful. And that's the trap. Real love doesn't come itemized. The moment support gets used to control your choices, it stops being a gift. It becomes a leash with a bow on it. The 10th and final sign is the quietest, but maybe the most painful. They dismiss what you feel before you even finish saying it. Back in my day, we didn't have anxiety. We just worked. You're too sensitive. Everyone goes through that. Your pain gets measured against theirs and somehow always comes up short. So you learn to minimize yourself before anyone else can. You laugh off what actually hurts. You stop bringing things up at all because being dismissed feels worse than staying silent. But your feelings were never a competition to be won or lost. They were simply real. And a parent who can't hold space for that isn't protecting you from weakness. They're protecting themselves from responsibility. Here's the part that makes this so complicated. Most parents crossing these lines were never taught anything different. They grew up in homes where obedience was love, where privacy was suspicious, where feelings were inconvenient. Nobody sat them down and said boundaries could exist alongside closeness. So they parent the only way they know, by holding on tightly, because letting go was never modeled as safe. That doesn't excuse the pain it causes you now, but it explains why this pattern feels so hard to name, so hard to confront. You're not just setting a boundary with a person. You're pushing against generations of unspoken rules that were never actually chosen, just inherited quietly, like an old debt nobody remembers signing for.
And here's what all 10 signs add up to, over years, quietly. A person who apologizes too much, who shrinks their needs before anyone else can reject them, who feels guilty for wanting privacy, space, or simply a different life. You might catch yourself over-explaining decisions to people who were never actually asking. You might feel a flicker of dread before every family call. That's not weakness. That's the residue of years spent being told in 100 small ways that your boundaries were negotiable and your feelings were optional. The exhausting part isn't any single moment. It's the accumulation. It's carrying all 10 of these quietly for years and calling it normal because you never had another version to compare it to.
So what actually helps? Start small. Boundaries don't need to be dramatic to be real. A simple, calm, "that doesn't work for me," is enough. You don't owe an essay of justification for needing space. Expect pushback at first. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries rarely celebrate you finding them. Stay consistent anyway, because consistency, not confrontation, is what actually teaches people the new rules. It also helps to separate the relationship from the pattern. You can love your parents and still refuse to keep absorbing behavior that hurts you. And if guilt shows up, let it. Guilt doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It often just means you're doing something new. And here's the hopeful part, the one that's easy to miss. Boundaries don't have to end the relationship. Often, they're what finally makes it honest. Some parents, once they understand you're not punishing them, actually adjust. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Others won't, and that's painful, but it's still not a reason to abandon the boundary. Not every relationship heals the same way, and not every parent will meet you halfway. But you get to decide how much access your life gives to people, regardless of blood. This isn't about cutting people off in anger. It's about finally choosing closeness on terms that don't cost you yourself. That's not betrayal. That's what a healthy relationship actually requires. Take a second and be honest with yourself. How many of these 10 did you recognize instantly? How many did you brush off years ago, telling yourself it was normal? It was just how families are. Maybe you're the one setting a boundary for the first time this year. Maybe you're still working up the courage. Either way, noticing the pattern is already the hardest part, because you can't set a boundary around something you've never let yourself name. So ask yourself, quietly, without judgment, which one of these 10 hurt the most to watch? That answer probably tells you exactly where to start.
Let's bring it all together. Showing up unannounced, unsolicited advice that turns into pressure, guilt used as a weapon, constant comparison, a no that never gets respected, comments about your body, overriding how you raise your own kids, reading your messages, your mail, your life, money used as leverage, and feelings dismissed before they're even heard. 10 signs, but really just one pattern underneath all of them, a refusal to see you as a separate, whole adult with the right to your own choices. Naming it doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you someone finally ready to build a relationship based on respect, not old habits nobody questioned.
If even one of these 10 hit close to home, you're not overreacting, and you're definitely not alone. This comment section is full of people who know exactly what you're describing. Tell me which sign was the hardest to read. Was it the comparisons? The guilt? The money? Sometimes just typing it out, seeing it named by someone else, is the first step toward actually setting the boundary in real life. And if this video gave you language for something you've felt for years, share it with someone who needs it too. Maybe a sibling who's been carrying the exact same weight in silence, wondering if it was just them. Boundaries with the people who raised you are some of the hardest ones to set, precisely because the love is real, even when the behavior isn't okay. You can hold both truths at once, that they did their best with what they knew, and that their best still isn't a reason to keep shrinking yourself. You get to choose differently now, quietly, firmly, without needing anyone's permission. If this helped you understand yourself or someone in your life a little better, subscribe. There's a lot more of this waiting for you. Until next time, take care of yourself the way you deserve to be taken care of all along. You love your child. You've always been there. But what if the very thing you call love is quietly dismantling the life they were supposed to build? What if helping too much is the most invisible way to hurt someone? We're about to walk through 10 signs that most parents never recognize in themselves. Some will feel uncomfortable. A few might sting. Stay with it, because what comes after the discomfort is something genuinely worth having.
Overparenting doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like love. It looks like phone calls every morning, solving problems before they're even named, softening every landing. Psychology calls it enmeshment. Real life calls it normal. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous.
Here's the first sign, and it's sneaky. Your adult child hits a wall, a conflict at work, a confusing bill, an argument with a partner, and within minutes, you're the one holding the phone, making the call, smoothing it over. It feels like help. It feels like being a good parent. But every time you step in before they've had a chance to struggle, you send them a message they didn't ask for. You can't handle this alone. Over time, they start to believe it. The problem-solving muscle only grows when it's used. You've been doing their reps for them. Sign 2. You monitor their daily life. Do you know what they ate yesterday? Whether they slept enough? Who they spent the weekend with? If you can answer most of those questions without them volunteering the information, that's worth pausing on. Staying deeply informed about an adult child's daily life often feels like closeness, but there's a difference between connection and surveillance, even when the surveillance comes from a genuine care. When parents track, check in constantly, and expect real-time updates, adult children learn to perform their lives rather than live them. They manage your worry instead of building their own awareness. That's an exhausting way to exist.
Sign 3. You financially rescue them repeatedly. Money is one of the most powerful teachers life has. When rent is tight, when a purchase was impulsive, when the numbers don't add up at the end of the month, that friction is information. It teaches prioritization, consequence, restraint. But when a parent steps in every single time the finances wobble, that lesson never lands. And what's more, the adult child never fully experiences themselves as someone capable of figuring it out. Chronic financial rescue feels generous. It is generous, but it also communicates, quietly and repeatedly, that you don't believe they can survive without you. Eventually, neither do they. Sign 4. You fight their battles. Maybe you called their landlord when they had a dispute. Maybe you emailed their professor, spoke to their employer, got involved in a friendship conflict that was really theirs to navigate. Each time, it probably felt justified. The situation was unfair. They were upset. You could fix it faster. And you could. But adulthood is built on the experience of advocating for yourself, of walking into an uncomfortable room and finding your voice. Every battle you fight on their behalf is a moment they don't get to discover what they're made of, and those moments, accumulated, are how a person learns to trust themselves. Sign 5. You make their decisions. This one hides in plain sight. You don't think of yourself as controlling. You just have opinions, strong ones. And when your adult child is choosing an apartment, a job, a partner, a city to live in, your opinion arrives fully formed with weight behind it. And somehow they keep choosing what you'd choose. Or they choose differently and spend months managing your reaction. Real autonomy means making decisions and living with the consequences, including the wrong ones. When a parent's approval is the invisible variable in every major life choice, the adult child isn't really choosing. They're seeking permission. And that dynamic, quietly, hollows out the self. Sign 6. You can't tolerate their pain. When your child is hurting, something in you needs it to stop. That's not a flaw. That's love in its rawest form. But here's what happens when that instinct runs without limits. You rush to fix feelings that were never meant to be fixed, only felt. Grief needs to be grieved. Disappointment needs to land. Failure needs to leave a mark, not a scar, but a memory. When a parent consistently rescues their child from emotional discomfort, that adult never learns to metabolize hard feelings. They reach adulthood emotionally fragile, not because life was cruel, but because it was always interrupted. Sign 7. Your identity is wrapped in their success. This sign lives inside the parent, not the child, which makes it harder to see. When your adult child succeeds, you feel it as your own success. When they struggle, you feel it as your own failure. Their life becomes the primary measure of your worth, and that's an enormous weight to place on someone who is simply trying to figure out who they are. Parents who are deeply enmeshed in their child's outcomes, consciously or not, create pressure that never speaks its name. The child feels it as expectation, as an invisible debt. They start making choices to manage your emotional state, rather than build their own life. There are a few more important signs ahead, but if this resonates with you, subscribe to Mind Patterns so you don't miss our upcoming breakdowns on psychology and mental health. Sign 8. You guilt them into closeness. Not all guilt is delivered with anger. Some of it arrives softly, a sigh when they cancel plans, a quiet, "No, it's fine," that means the opposite, a comment about how little you see them these days. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like honesty. But when adult children make their life choices based on managing a parent's disappointment rather than following their own compass, something quietly fractures. Closeness built on guilt isn't closeness. It's debt. And the relationship becomes a place they feel obligated to visit, rather than a place they genuinely want to return to. That's a painful outcome for everyone. Sign 9. You dismiss their choices. They chose a career you don't understand, a partner you'd never have picked, a city, a lifestyle, a set of values that look different from yours. And every time they bring it up, something in the conversation makes clear that your approval is still pending. Dismissal doesn't require harsh words. It lives in raised eyebrows, in redirected questions, in the absence of genuine curiosity about their world. When a parent persistently withholds respect for an adult child's choices, that child faces an impossible equation: be themselves or keep the peace.
Many spend years trying to solve it. Most can't do both.
Sign 10. You've never redefined the relationship. This is the deepest one. Your child was 6, then 16, then 26. And somewhere in that passage of time, the relationship was supposed to change shape. Not end, change. The dynamic that worked when they needed you for everything was always meant to evolve into something between two adults who choose each other freely. But many parents never make that transition. They keep showing up as the authority, the rescuer, the one who knows best, because that role was built over decades and it's hard to release. And without that release, the adult child can never fully step into themselves or into a real relationship with you.
Psychology has a name for this pattern: enmeshment. It's a term from family systems theory, describing relationships where boundaries dissolve, where one person's emotions, identity, and decisions become so intertwined with another's that individuation becomes nearly impossible. Enmeshed parents aren't villains. Most of them were raised in families where closeness and fusion were the same thing, where independence felt like abandonment. The behavior gets passed down, not through cruelty, but through love that never learned its own limits. Understanding this doesn't excuse the impact, but it does change how we approach the work of changing it. Context isn't comfort, it's a starting point.
Here's what over-parenting actually costs. Adult children who've been over-parented often struggle to trust their own judgment. They second-guess decisions that should feel natural. They feel anxious without external validation. They build relationships that mirror the dynamic they grew up in, seeking partners who parent them, or withdrawing entirely to find the autonomy they never had. And the grief runs both ways. Parents who overparent often end up lonely, not because their children stopped loving them, but because the relationship was never allowed to grow into something mutual. Love without boundaries doesn't bring people closer. Eventually, it pushes them apart.
So, what do you actually do with this? First, notice without punishing yourself. Awareness is the beginning, not the verdict. Second, practice the pause. The next time your instinct is to step in, wait. Ask them what they think before offering what you think. Third, get curious about who they are now, not who they were at 12. Ask questions without agendas. Listen without solving. Fourth, consider talking to someone, a therapist, a family counselor, someone trained in exactly this kind of relational shift. This isn't about doing less, it's about doing differently, and that distinction is everything.
Here's what's also true. Involvement is not the enemy. Caring deeply about your adult child's life is not a pathology. The line between support and overparenting isn't always clean, and pretending it is would be dishonest. What matters is whether your involvement leaves room for their autonomy, whether your love has enough space in it for them to fail, to choose differently, to need you less. The healthiest parent-adult-child relationships aren't the ones with the most contact. They're the ones where both people feel free, where showing up is a choice, not an obligation, on both sides.
Before you move on from this video, sit with one question. Not which sign was the worst, not whether your parent did this to you, though that reflection matters too. Just this: is there one moment, one habit, one pattern in how you show up for your adult child that you'd like to change? Not overhaul, not fix overnight, just one thing. Because change in relationships rarely happens in revelations. It happens in small, repeated choices to show up differently. You don't need to be a different person. You just need to be willing to try a different way.
Let's bring it back together. 10 signs that helping has crossed into harm. Solving their problems, monitoring their daily life, repeated financial rescue, fighting their battles, making their decisions, being unable to tolerate their pain, tying your identity to their success, guilting them into closeness, dismissing their choices, and never redefining the relationship as they grew up. None of these signs make someone a bad parent. They make someone a human parent, one who loves deeply and learned certain patterns without realizing their cost. The recognition itself is meaningful, and recognizing it at any age, in any season of life, is where something new can begin.
If something in this video landed, leave a comment, not to perform reflection, but because reading what actually resonates with real people is how this channel stays honest and human. If you recognized yourself as a parent or as someone who was overparented, that awareness is worth something. Share this with someone who might need it. And if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of how we love, how we attach, and how we change, subscribe. There's more coming that I think you'll find genuinely useful. Thank you for watching the whole way through. That kind of attention is rare. Take care of yourself. You think you know them. You live with them, work with them, maybe raised them. But there's a growing gap between what you think is happening and what's actually going on inside a millennial's mind. And that gap, it's costing you.
In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 10 signs that reveal a fundamental misunderstanding, and more importantly, what each one is actually telling you. Stay through all 10. The last view might be the ones that change everything. Millennials, Generation Y, born roughly between 1981 and 1996. They grew up between analog childhoods and digital adulthoods. That unique position shaped everything: how they think, how they work, how they love, and why they frustrate people who don't speak their language.
Here's the first sign you don't really understand millennials. You watch them and you think, they're lazy, they don't want to work hard, they expect everything handed to them. But here's what's actually happening. Millennials entered the workforce during one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. They worked hard, got the degrees they were promised would open doors, and found those doors locked. What looks like laziness is often exhaustion, strategic withdrawal from systems that repeatedly failed them. They're not refusing to work, they're refusing to destroy themselves for institutions that never kept their end of the deal. That's not laziness, that's a boundary. The second sign is a contradiction, and it's a telling one. Some people accuse millennials of being obsessed with money. Others say they're irresponsible with it. Both can't be right. Here's the truth. Millennials are the first generation statistically expected to be worse off financially than their parents. They carry more student debt than any generation before them. They watched homeownership become a fantasy. So yes, money weighs on them constantly. But they've also learned that chasing money at the cost of everything else is a trap. That tension isn't confusion, it's a deeply rational response to a broken financial system.
Sign 3. You notice they switch jobs, they delay marriage, they rent instead of buy, and your conclusion is they can't commit, they're afraid of responsibility. But commitment, for millennials, was redefined by what they witnessed growing up. They watched long-term jobs disappear overnight. They watched marriages fall apart. They watched loyalty go unrewarded. So what changed? Their threshold for why they commit. They don't commit less, they commit differently. to meaning over obligation, to growth over stability for its own sake. Calling that an inability to commit completely misses the psychological shift that happened beneath the surface of their entire coming-of-age story.
Here's sign 4, and it's one of the most damaging misunderstandings on this list. When millennials talk openly about anxiety, burnout, depression, or therapy, some people roll their eyes. They call it weakness, oversharing, victimhood. But what's actually happening is a generational breakthrough in emotional literacy. Millennials were the first generation to collectively say, pretending you're fine when you're not fine doesn't work. They broke a silence that caused immeasurable hidden suffering in the generations before them. When a millennial names what they're feeling, that's not fragility. That's intelligence applied to the inner world. And dismissing it doesn't make you tough. It makes you less informed.
Sign 5. The phone. You see them looking at it constantly, and you think addiction, distraction, disconnection from real life. But here's the fuller picture. For millennials, the phone is infrastructure. It's where their work lives, their relationships live, their finances, their creative work, their communities. Telling a millennial to put their phone down is a bit like telling someone from an earlier generation to stop using the telephone, the newspaper, and the post office simultaneously. The medium changed. The human need to connect, to create, to stay informed is exactly the same. The behavior isn't the problem. The misreading of the behavior is. Sign 6 cuts deep. You gave them opportunities. You worked hard so they'd have more than you did. And still, they seem unsatisfied, unhappy, like nothing is ever enough. So you conclude, ungrateful. But what's actually happening is a collision of values. The things that felt like success to one generation, stability, ownership, a steady job, simply don't carry the same psychological weight for millennials. Not because they're spoiled, because their definition of a good life was shaped by completely different experiences and pressures. What they're searching for isn't more stuff, it's meaning. And searching for meaning isn't ingratitude. It's one of the most deeply human things there is.
We're halfway through, and if any of the first 6 signs landed close to home, that's exactly the point. Understanding doesn't mean agreeing with everything. It means seeing clearly. The next 4 signs go deeper, into the workplace, into relationships, into the quiet places where most of the real misunderstanding actually lives. And here's what I want you to hold on to as we go forward. Every single sign on this list points to the same underlying truth. Millennials aren't a mystery, they're a mirror, and what they reflect back might be more important than anything else in this video. Let's keep going. Sign 7. In meetings, in families, in conversations, millennials push back. They question decisions. They want to know why. And to many people, that reads as disrespect, as arrogance, as an inability to follow leadership. But here's what's actually underneath it. Millennials grew up watching authority figures fail spectacularly and publicly. Politicians, corporations, institutions, public figures. Trust, for them, is not automatic. It's earned. They don't distrust authority because they're rebellious. They distrust it because they were given very good reasons to. What looks like disrespect is actually a request. Show me you deserve it. Lead with transparency, not just title. That's not arrogance. That's accountability.
Sign 8. You've heard it. Millennials are killing restaurants, department stores, diamonds, golf, napkins. The list never ends. And the narrative is always the same. They're just being contrarian.
rejecting things for the sake of it. But the actual reason is far less dramatic and far more logical. Millennials have less disposable income than previous generations at the same age. They prioritize experiences over objects. They're environmentally conscious in ways that actively shape purchasing decisions. When they stop buying something, it's because that something no longer fits their financial reality or their values. That's not destruction. That's a market responding to a generation that grew up with less and learned to want differently.
Sign 9 shows up most clearly in the workplace. Millennials want feedback, regular feedback, honest feedback, and managers or parents who didn't grow up with that culture often read it as neediness, insecurity, an inability to just get on with the job. But here's the psychology. Millennials were raised in educational environments that emphasized continuous feedback loops, grades, assessments, constant evaluation. That shaped their learning style at a neurological level. Feedback isn't a comfort blanket for them. It's data. It's how they calibrate, improve, and know they're on the right track. When you withhold it, they don't feel empowered. They feel invisible. And invisible people eventually leave.
And here is sign 10, perhaps the most quietly damaging assumption of all, that this is a phase, that eventually millennials will settle down, stop asking difficult questions, accept the way things are, and become the previous generation. But that's not what's happening. The values millennials hold around work-life integration, mental health, purpose, sustainability, financial realism, these aren't youthful idealism they'll abandon. They're responses to the world they actually inherited. They're not waiting to grow up. They already did, and they grew up into a set of convictions that aren't going anywhere. The sooner that's understood, the sooner real connection becomes possible.
Every single sign we've walked through points to the same route. Millennials didn't arrive at their values in a vacuum. They were shaped by the 2008 financial crisis, by September 11th as formative adolescence, by the rise of the internet, by the collapse of traditional career paths, and by a mental health epidemic that finally got named. When you understand the forces that shaped a generation, their behaviors stop being baffling and start making complete sense. This isn't about excusing everything or agreeing with everything. It's about replacing assumption with understanding. And understanding, real understanding, is always the beginning of something better.
Here's the part that often goes unsaid. When millennials feel misunderstood, chronically, repeatedly, by the people who matter most to them, it doesn't just create frustration. It creates distance. It creates loneliness. It creates the quiet decision to stop explaining themselves because experience taught them it leads nowhere. And on the other side of that gap, the people who love them, manage them, or raise them are left confused and hurt, wondering why the connection they want keeps slipping away. The misunderstanding costs both sides. The distance is real, and it doesn't have to stay that way. That's exactly why this conversation matters. So what do you actually do with all of this? Start with one question. Instead of asking what's wrong with them, ask what shaped them. That single shift changes everything. When a millennial pushes back, get curious before you get defensive. When they talk about mental health, listen before you evaluate. When they make a choice that confuses you, ask about it, genuinely, not to challenge, but to understand. You don't have to agree with every value or every decision, but agreement was never the goal. The goal is connection, and connection starts the moment you choose understanding over assumption. That moment is available to you right now. Now, a little nuance, because this conversation deserves it.
Not every generalization applies to every millennial. This is a generation of over 2 billion people across dozens of cultures and wildly different life circumstances. Some millennials do struggle with accountability. Some carry real entitlement. Every generation has its shadows. The point isn't to idealize them. The point is to see them clearly. The pressures they inherited, the adaptations they made, the genuine strengths they developed. Nuance doesn't weaken understanding, it deepens it. And when you can hold both the complexity and the compassion at the same time, that's when real wisdom actually begins.
Before we wrap up, a moment just for you. Think about the millennial in your life. A child, a partner, a colleague, a friend. How many of the 10 signs showed up in how you've seen them? Not as a judgment, but as information. Because here's what I've found to be true. The places where we most misunderstand others are usually the places where our own assumptions are loudest. The friction isn't always about them. Sometimes it's about the story we decided was true before we ever really asked. What would change if you let that story go? Sit with that for just a moment.
Let's bring it all together. 10 signs you don't really understand millennials. 1. You think they're lazy. 2. You misread their relationship with money. 3. You mistake intentional commitment for avoidance. 4. You see emotional openness as weakness. 5. You misinterpret the phone. 6. You read the search for meaning as ingratitude. 7. You call accountability disrespect. 8. You misunderstand their consumer choices. 9. You see the need for feedback as neediness. 10. You believe they'll simply grow out of it. Each of these signs is a door, and every door, once you walk through it, leads to something genuinely better.
Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 10 signs hit closest to home? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video helped you see something differently, share it with someone in your life who might need it. That one act of sharing might open a conversation that's been waiting to happen for years. If you want to go deeper into the psychology of generations, money mindset, and human behavior, subscribe and hit the bell. We go deep here every week. Thank you for watching all the way through. That tells me you care. And people who care, they're exactly who this channel is for.
You said something completely normal, something you've said 100 times, and the moment it left your mouth, you felt it. A shift. The room got quieter. Their faces closed off. You lost them, and you still don't know why. In the next few minutes, you'll hear 12 phrases that silently kill your credibility with younger generations. Some will surprise you, some will sting a little, but every single one is worth knowing before you say it again.
Gen Z and Millennials don't lose respect loudly. They don't argue. They just disconnect. And the trigger is often language, specific phrases that signal you're out of touch, dismissive, or simply not safe to trust with real conversation.
Because I said so. This phrase has ended more conversations than any argument ever could. When you say, "because I said so," you're not asserting authority, you're revealing that you've run out of reasons. And younger generations who grew up questioning everything hear exactly that. They were raised in an era of information. Google was always one tap away. So when an adult refused to explain their reasoning, it didn't feel like discipline, It felt like control, like something was being hidden. Today, when they hear this phrase from a manager, a parent, or a leader, that same childhood alarm goes off. Trust quietly walks out the door.
We've always done it this way. Nothing signals a closed mind faster than this sentence. For Gen Z and Millennials, tradition isn't automatically respect-worthy. It has to earn its place. They grew up watching entire industries collapse because someone refused to adapt. Blockbuster, Kodak, newspapers. The phrase, "we've always done it this way," doesn't inspire loyalty in them. It triggers quiet panic. It tells them you're not a leader navigating forward. You're someone holding on to a map of a city that no longer exists. And in a world that changes faster than most people can process, that's not authority. That's a liability.
You're too sensitive. This phrase does something particularly damaging. It doesn't just dismiss what someone said, it dismisses who they are. Gen Z grew up in a mental health conversation. They learned the language of feelings, boundaries, and emotional safety from a young age. When someone tells them they're too sensitive, they don't think, maybe they're right. They think, this person is not safe. And once that label sticks, once you become someone who minimizes emotions, your words carry a permanent asterisk. You might be brilliant, you might be right, but they've already decided they won't be fully honest with you, and that distance never fully closes.
That's not how the real world works. Here's the irony. The people most likely to say this phrase are often least prepared for how the real world actually works. Right now, Gen Z and Millennials built careers on platforms that didn't exist 10 years ago. They've survived recessions, a pandemic, a completely broken housing market. So when someone older says, "That's not how the real world works," they don't hear wisdom. They hear someone defending a rule book that's already been rewritten. It doesn't land as guidance, it lands as gatekeeping, and it instantly positions you as someone who stopped learning, which is the fastest way to lose the room.
I don't see color, gender, differences. This phrase is meant to sound inclusive. It almost always does the opposite. For younger generations, identity isn't something to be erased in the name of fairness. It's something to be acknowledged and respected. Saying you don't see someone's race, gender, or background doesn't communicate equality. It communicates erasure. It says, "I'm most comfortable when I don't have to think about what makes you different from me." And that kind of comfort, the comfort of pretending difference doesn't exist, signals to Gen Z and Millennials that you haven't done the work. Not because you're bad, but because you haven't been curious enough.
Man up, toughen up. This phrase carries decades of damage inside it, and the people saying it usually have no idea. Man up, toughen up. Don't be a crybaby. These aren't motivational phrases to younger generations. They're red flags. They signal that emotional expression is weakness, that vulnerability is embarrassing, and that the person saying it has built their identity around suppressing feelings rather than processing them. Millennials have the highest therapy rates of any generation. Gen Z normalized mental health conversations in ways that were unthinkable 15 years ago. When you tell them to man up, you're not inspiring strength. You're showing them exactly why so many people suffer in silence.
We're halfway through, and I want to ask you something honestly. Have you already recognized yourself in one of these? Because most people have. And that's not a reason to feel defensive. That's actually the point. These phrases aren't used by bad people. They're used by people who learned a certain way of communicating and never got the feedback that it wasn't landing. The second half of this list gets more specific, more modern. Some of these phrases are ones you probably heard just last week or said. Stay with me. The next 6 mattered just as much as the first. There are a few more important signs ahead, but if this resonates with you, subscribe to Mind Patterns so you don't miss our upcoming breakdowns on psychology and mental health.
Back in my day, every generation has earned its stories. The problem isn't having them, it's weaponizing them. When "back in my day" becomes a comparison that ends with "so you have it easy" or "we didn't complain," it stops being a story and starts being a verdict. Gen Z and Millennials aren't interested in suffering Olympics. They're not going to respect your authority more because you walked uphill both ways in the snow. What they respond to is relevance. What they trust is someone who takes their current reality seriously, not someone who uses the past as a measuring stick to make the present seem small.
No offense, but everyone under 40 knows exactly what comes after "no offense, but" something offensive. This phrase has become so transparently self-serving that it functions as a warning label, not a disclaimer. It signals that the speaker knows what they're about to say is unkind, and they've decided to say it anyway, while asking not to be held accountable. For younger generations who value directness and emotional honesty, this kind of linguistic loophole reads as cowardly. They'd rather you just say the hard thing plainly, or not at all. The preemptive shield doesn't protect you. It just tells them you already know you're wrong.
You just need to pay your dues. This phrase made sense in a world where loyalty to one company for 30 years guaranteed a pension and a gold watch. That world is gone. Gen Z and Millennials watched their parents do everything right, work hard, stay loyal, pay their dues, and still get laid off, lose their savings, or retire with nothing. So when someone tells them to just be patient and pay their dues, they don't hear encouragement. They hear a system defending itself. They hear someone who benefited from rules that no longer apply, asking them to play along anyway. That's not inspiring. That's asking someone to trust a bridge that's already collapsed.
That's just how business works. Younger generations built entire movements around questioning exactly this phrase. They watched corporations pollute, exploit, mislead, and then use "that's just business" as a get-out-of-jail-free card. For Gen Z especially, business is not separate from ethics. They choose employers based on values. They quit jobs over culture. They boycott brands with a single tweet. So when you use this phrase to justify something that feels wrong, cutting corners, dismissing people, ignoring impact, they don't think you're being pragmatic. They think you've decided convenience is more important than conscience. And that tells them everything they need to know about who you really are.
I'm just being honest. Honesty is not a weapon, but this phrase is often used like one. "I'm just being honest" frequently serves as permission to say something cruel without consequence, a way to dress up on kindness in the language of virtue. Gen Z and Millennials didn't grow up believing that bluntness equals truth. They were raised in a culture that started asking, can you be honest and kind? Can you be direct and considerate? When someone prefaces a cutting remark with "I'm just being honest," they don't earn respect, they lose it. Because younger generations have learned that cruelty with a disclaimer is still cruelty. Why are you always on your phone? This one might be the most ironic phrase on the list, because the people saying it are usually also on their phones. But beyond the hypocrisy, this question carries an assumption that digital life is somehow less real than physical life. For Gen Z, the phone isn't a distraction from their world. It is part of their world. Community, creativity, career, connection, all of it lives there. When you dismiss that with frustration or contempt, you're not protecting them from technology. You're telling them their reality doesn't count. And the fastest way to lose someone's respect is to make them feel like their entire life is a problem to be solved.
Here's what all 12 of these phrases have in common. None of them are said with the intention to harm. Most are said out of habit or pressure, or because someone once said them to us and we survived. But surviving something doesn't make it harmless. Language carries history. Phrases carry power. And the gap between what we mean to communicate and what the other person actually receives, that gap is where trust either builds or breaks. Understanding why these words land badly isn't about guilt. It's about awareness. And awareness in communication is the beginning of everything that actually works. Think about a time someone said one of these things to you. Maybe a parent, a boss, a teacher. Do you remember how it felt? Not just in the moment, but after. How it made you smaller, or more guarded, or less likely to try again. That feeling is exactly what you are creating when you reach for these phrases under pressure. Not because you're trying to, but because we tend to repeat what we've absorbed. The people who've said these things to you probably didn't realize the weight they were carrying either. That's the quiet tragedy of unexamined language. It echoes forward. So what do you replace these phrases with? Start with curiosity instead of conclusions. Instead of, because I said so, try, here's my thinking, tell me yours. Instead of, you're too sensitive, try, help me understand what landed wrong. Instead of, that's just how business works, try, I hear the concern, let me think about that. These aren't soft alternatives, they're stronger ones. They invite dialogue instead of shutting it down. They signal that you're someone worth talking to, not just someone to report to or survive. And that shift from authority through control to authority through trust is what actually earns lasting respect. None of this means you have to agree with everything Gen Z or Millennials believe. You don't have to abandon your values or pretend generational differences don't exist. Respect isn't agreement. Authority isn't uniformity. What younger generations actually want, more than anything, is to feel like they're talking to someone who's genuinely present, someone who takes them seriously enough to explain, to listen, to adjust. The phrases in this video don't just fail with younger people, they fail with anyone who wants to feel seen. Dropping them isn't a cultural concession, it's just better communication, and better communication makes everything, every relationship, every team, every conversation, work. Before you move on from this video, just sit with one question. Which of these 12 phrases is yours? Not because you're a bad communicator, but because we all have one. A default under stress, a go-to when we feel challenged or dismissed or simply tired. The phrase we reach for when we don't know what else to say. Identifying it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're paying attention. And paying attention to how your words land, to what they signal, to the gap between your intention and their experience. That's not weakness. That's exactly what authority looks like when it's actually earned. Let's bring it home. 12 phrases, each one a small fracture in the foundation of trust. Because I said so. We've always done it this way. You're too sensitive. That's not how the real world works. I don't see differences. Man up. Back in my day. No offense, but pay your dues. That's just business. I'm just being honest. Why are you always on your phone? None of these are unforgivable. All of them are replaceable. And every time you choose a better phrase, one that opens instead of closes, you're not just communicating differently. You're becoming someone people actually want to follow. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 12 hit closest to home? Was there one you've heard constantly from a parent, a boss, a coach? Or one you recognized in yourself and felt that little uncomfortable twinge? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, because this conversation matters, and your experience adds something mine can't. If this video made you think, share it with someone who might need it, not as a call-out, as a conversation starter. And if you want more videos like this on how language shapes power, trust, and connection, subscribe. There's a lot more worth talking about. Thank you for watching all the way through. That tells me something about you, that you take this seriously, that you're someone who wants to communicate better, not just more confidently. Those are different things, and knowing the difference already puts you ahead of most. The world doesn't need louder voices, it needs clearer ones. Ones that make people feel heard instead of managed, respected instead of handled, trusted instead of just tolerated. That's the kind of authority that lasts, not because it demands loyalty, but because it earns it every single time. See you in the next one.
There's someone in your life right now who drains you. Every conversation leaves you exhausted, confused, or quietly angry. You didn't choose this, but you stayed, and somewhere deep down, you already know exactly who I'm talking about.
In the next few minutes, you're going to learn 10 strategies that actually work. Not just survive toxic people, but stop letting them live rent-free in your head. No drama, no explosions. Just quiet, powerful moves that protect your peace.
Toxic people rarely announce themselves. They show up as friends, coworkers, family. And the damage they do isn't always loud. It's slow. A comment here, a guilt trip there, until one day you realize you've been shrinking yourself to keep them comfortable. Way 1. Set clear boundaries without explaining yourself. Most people think boundaries need a full explanation, a reason, an apology. They don't. When you over-explain your limits to a toxic person, you're handing them a map to argue around them. No is a complete sentence. I can't make it doesn't need 3 paragraphs of justification. The moment you start explaining, they start negotiating. And toxic people are very good at negotiating. What actually works is calm, consistent repetition. Same answer, same tone, no matter how many times they push. You're not being cold, you're being clear. And clarity, real clarity, is one of the most protective things you can give yourself. Way to stop trying to fix them. Here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. You cannot fix a toxic person. You can understand them, you can feel compassion for whatever pain made them this way, but you cannot love someone into changing if they don't want to change. Every time you try, you pour your energy into a container with no bottom. It just disappears. And meanwhile, your own life waits. The shift that changes everything is simple. Stop making their growth your responsibility. You're not their therapist. You're not their parent. You're a person who deserves relationships that don't require you to constantly repair them. Way 3. Control your reactions, not their actions. Toxic people thrive on reaction. The moment you lose your composure, raise your voice, cry, storm off, they've won. Not because they're evil masterminds, but because drama gives them something to hold over you, something to reframe, something to use later. Your power isn't in controlling what they do, it's in controlling what you do next. One breath, one pause,
the choice to respond instead of react. This doesn't mean you suppress everything. It means you decide when and how your emotions appear. That pause, that tiny space between trigger and response, that's where your dignity lives. Protect it like it matters, because it does.
Way 4. Limit information sharing. Toxic people collect information. They file away your fears, your dreams, your insecurities, and they use them when it's convenient. Not always consciously, but the pattern is real. The more they know about your vulnerabilities, the more leverage they have. So you stop giving it to them. Not dramatically. You don't announce, "I'm not telling you things anymore." You just quietly become more selective. Surface conversations, polite but shallow. You talk about weather, work, nothing personal. They may not even notice at first, but you'll notice. You'll notice how much lighter you feel when you stop handing someone the keys to your interior world. Before we continue, the next 5 strategies are where things get genuinely interesting. Because the first 4 were about protection, drawing lines, pulling back. But what comes next is about something deeper. How you rebuild your inner world after toxic exposure. How you stop carrying conversations in your head that ended hours ago. How you stop rehearsing arguments with people who will never actually hear you. If you've ever replayed a painful interaction on loop at 2 in the morning, what's coming next was written for you. Stay with me. The second half of this list is the part people rarely talk about, but it's the part that actually changes things. There are a few more important signs ahead, but if this resonates with you, subscribe to Mind Patterns so you don't miss our upcoming breakdowns on psychology and mental health. Way 5. Gray Rock Method. There's a technique psychologists call the gray rock method. The idea is simple and almost elegant. You become as boring and unresponsive as a gray rock. No emotion, no interesting reactions, no fuel. Toxic people, especially those with narcissistic patterns, feed on emotional response. They escalate to get a rise out of you. When there's nothing to feed on, they lose interest and move on. You don't argue, you don't defend. You give flat, factual, one-word answers. Okay? Sure. I see. It feels strange at first, almost like you're disappearing. But you're not disappearing. You're removing yourself from a game you never agreed to play. That's not weakness. That's strategy. Way 6. Build distance gradually. You don't always have the option to cut someone off completely. Sometimes they're family. Sometimes they're a colleague you see every day. And the idea of a dramatic confrontation feels worse than just enduring it. So you don't cut. You drift. Slowly, intentionally, you make yourself less available. You take longer to reply. You say yes to fewer invitations. You stop initiating. There's no announcement, no fight, just a quiet repositioning of where this person sits in your life, from the front row to somewhere further back. It's not dishonest, it's self-preservation. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop showing up where you're not safe.
Way 7. Don't take the bait. Toxic people are extraordinarily good at one thing. They know exactly which buttons to press. They've been watching you. They know what makes you defensive, what makes you sad, what makes you explode. And sometimes they poke those places on purpose. It looks like an offhand comment, a joke that isn't quite a joke, a question designed to make you justify yourself.
The bait is always disguised as something else. The move, and this takes practice, is to see the hook before you swallow it. Name it internally. That's bait. Then consciously choose not to bite. You don't have to win every argument. Sometimes not playing is the win.
Way 8. Protect your energy with intention. Energy is real. You feel it. The difference between a conversation that leaves you buzzing and one that leaves you hollow. After time with a toxic person, that hollowness is data. It's your system telling you something. Start listening to it deliberately. Before you enter a difficult interaction, set an internal intention. I am here for 30 minutes. I will stay grounded. I will leave when I said I would. After, give yourself recovery time. Seriously. A walk. Silence. Something that refills you. This isn't self-indulgence. It's maintenance. You wouldn't run a car on empty and wonder why it stalls. Your nervous system works the same way.
Way 9. Seek outside perspective. One of the most disorienting things about toxic relationships is that they make you doubt your own perception. Gaslighting does that. Constant criticism does that. You start to wonder, am I the problem? Am I being too sensitive? That's exactly when you need an outside voice. A trusted friend, a therapist, someone who isn't inside the dynamic and can reflect reality back to you. Not to vent endlessly, but to reality check. To hear, no, that wasn't okay. Or sometimes, here's what you might be missing. Either way, you stop being the only witness to your own experience. That matters more than people realize.
Way 10. Know when to walk away completely. Sometimes the answer isn't a strategy, it's a door. There are people in this world who will take everything you offer, your patience, your compassion, your carefully held boundaries, and still leave you depleted. Not because you failed, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because some dynamics are genuinely incompatible with your well-being. Walking away isn't giving up. It isn't cruelty. It's one of the most honest and courageous things a person can do. Not every relationship deserves a place in your life. Some of them just need to be released, quietly, without drama, without guilt, because your peace is not negotiable. It never was. Here's what's worth understanding beneath all of this. Toxic behavior almost always comes from pain. That doesn't excuse it. It doesn't mean you have to absorb it. But when you understand that the person who controls, manipulates, or belittles is often operating from a place of deep insecurity or unhealed wounds, something shifts. You stop taking it personally, not because it doesn't hurt, it does, but because you can see it more clearly for what it is. Their behavior is about them. Your response is about you. That separation is everything. It's what keeps you from becoming bitter, from becoming the very thing you're trying to protect yourself from. If you've been dealing with a toxic person for a long time, there's a particular kind of tired that lives in your body. Not just physical tiredness, something deeper, a weariness that comes from constantly managing someone else's emotions, walking on eggshells, second-guessing your own instincts. That exhaustion is real, and it's valid. You're not weak for feeling it. You've been carrying something heavy. The fact that you're here, watching this, looking for a better way, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of something different. You don't have to figure it all out today, but noticing that something needs to change, that's already the first step.
So where do you start? Pick one thing from this list. Just one, not all 10. Don't try to overhaul every difficult relationship by next Tuesday. Choose the strategy that felt most true to your situation. Maybe it's setting a boundary without explaining. Maybe it's trying the gray rock method with that one person at work. Practice it this week. Notice what changes, not in them, but in you. How you feel after interactions, how much headspace they take up. That's your real measure of progress. Not whether they change, whether you do. Small shifts consistently applied are what actually move things. Start small. Start now.
None of this is easy, and it would be dishonest to pretend that applying these strategies will make everything clean and resolved. Some people in your life will push back when you start protecting yourself. Some will call you cold. Some will escalate. That's part of the process, and it's also information. Because when someone responds to your healthy boundaries with anger, that tells you something important about why those boundaries were necessary. But here's what's also true. On the other side of this work, relationships get quieter, lighter. The right people, the ones who actually respect you, they stay. And somehow, there's more room for them.
Before we wrap up, a moment of honest reflection. Because sometimes in our lives, we're not only dealing with toxic people. Sometimes, under enough stress or pain, we become harder to be around too. Not toxic, but sharper, more reactive, less patient. It's worth asking quietly, is there anywhere in my life where I'm bringing that energy? Not to beat yourself up, but because self-awareness is the foundation of everything we've talked about today. The healthiest people aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who keep looking inward, with honesty, and with just enough compassion to keep going.
Let's bring it all together. 10 ways to deal with toxic people without drama. Set boundaries without over-explaining. Stop trying to fix what isn't yours to fix. Control your reactions, not their actions. Limit what personal information you share. Use the gray rock method when needed. Build distance gradually and without announcement. Don't take the bait. See the hook first. Protect your energy with deliberate intention. Seek outside perspective to reality check your experience. And when necessary, walk away completely, without guilt. These aren't just tactics. They're a way of deciding that your inner life matters, that your peace is worth protecting. Because it is. It always has been.
If something in this video landed, if you recognized someone, or recognized yourself, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. What's the hardest part of dealing with a toxic person for you? Is it the boundaries? The walking away? The self-doubt? Tell me below. And if this was useful, share it with someone who needs it. Not everyone searches for this kind of content, but a lot of people need it. Subscribe if you want more of this. Real psychology, real situations, no fluff. Thank you for spending this time here. Take care of yourself out there. It genuinely matters. See you in the next one.